Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 577. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Got some big news on today's show talking about Israel's potential response to Iran and then the situation on the war in Ukraine. A lot there, a lot of important stuff to get through. So Share Today's Show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_ or follow the show at @con_interest. Let's get into the show. First up here today, just a few stories on what Israel may do in response to the Iranian strike, which was, of course, a response to the Israeli bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus. So the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the UN, the world watchdog on nuclear weapons, nuclear programs, says they are worried Israel may strike Iran's nuclear program in response to the Iranian drone and missile attack on Israeli territory, which of course was a reprisal for Israel's bombing Iran's consulate in Damascus. The IAEA chief, that's Rafa Grossi, told reporters on Monday that Iran temporarily closed its nuclear facilities on Sunday over security concerns that the agency's inspectors did not return to facilities when they reopened on Monday. We are always concerned about this possibility, Grossi said, of a potential Israeli attack. He said the IAEA inspectors will return on Tuesday. He said, I decided not to let the inspectors return until we see what the situation is completely calm. Israel has a history of targeting Iranian nuclear facilities in covert attacks, including a 2021 drone attack that damaged IAEA cameras at a centrifuge facility, which has impeded the IAEA's inspection regime. In the recent years, Israeli officials have consistently threatened Iranian nuclear facilities and are always claiming Tehran is trying to build a nuclear bomb. But there is no evidence that Iran is seeking nuclear weapons, which is recently reaffirmed by the annual threat assessment produced by U.S. intelligence agencies. The assessment reads, Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. Grossi also said on Monday that there is no evidence Iran is trying to build a bomb. He said, as far as the agency is concerned, we don't have any information or indication that there is a nuclear weapons program in Iran. And so here we have the IAEA being very concerned that Israel is going to attack Iran's civilian nuclear energy infrastructure. This is, should be extremely concerning for the world and be a very big, flashing red light that Israel is really this rogue state at this point that's willing to do and create as many wars, as much upheaval and death as possible to create the cover for what they believe they need to conduct the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So Iran is currently enriching some uranium at 60%, the highest level which has ever reached, which is still lower than the 90% needed for weapons grade. Iran took the step to enrich at 60% in response to an Israeli attack on its Natanz nuclear facility in April of 2021. The Iran nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA, limited Iran's uranium enrichment to 3.67% and imposed other strict rules on Iran's nuclear program, but the Trump administration tore up the deal in 2018 while Iran was still in full compliance with it, and about a year later, Tehran began slowly enriching at higher levels. It took the step to increase to 20% in response to the Israeli assassination of Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November of 2022. And so essentially what you have halfway through the Trump administration is the U.S. exiting the JCPOA for a full year and a half rather than do anything with their nuclear program. The Iranian response was to just beg the Europeans to, hey, look, we know the Americans are in full breach of this deal, that we're in full compliance with it. We want to remain in this deal, and we will remain in the nuclear program or the nuclear deal as long as the Europeans basically ignored the Americans leaving the deal, and the Europeans flirted with the idea but never really committed to it. And so Iran then said, all right, well, we're going to not comply with this agreement that the U.S. has imposed sanctions on, when we were in compliance with it, and the Europeans are unwilling to stand up to the Americans in any meaningful way and ignore the American sanctions. So Europe is essentially sanctioned us as well. And we've not only seen Iran, ramp up their civilian nuclear energy program in response, they have also reached out and done more business with Russia and China, as they feel that their markets will just never be open to the West because their markets are closed to the West over this fake nuclear threat. And in the same time period, Israel, anytime the Americans started talking to the Iranians, Israel would then conduct some sort of attack on Iran, whether it was seizing Iranian ships, whether it was conducting assassinations inside of Iran, bombing Iranians in Syria. Israel was constantly doing something to make sure that the Iranians would not want to engage with the Americans. And so, the assassination of nuclear scientists and other top officials, even within Iran, drone attacks on Iranian facilities are other examples. One thing worth pointing out here is the international community, the Western international community, the likes of, David Cameron, members of the American government, point out that the Iranian attack on Israel's over the past weekend was a unique state-on-state attack, which, is just ridiculous because Israel bombs most of its neighbors on a near weekly basis, including Syria for the past decade. Lebanon has been bombed frequently. They bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria, which of course is a diplomat building, sovereign Iranian territory. So, that's a state-on-state attack technically. But, in the past, again, Israel has launched drones at Iranian nuclear facilities, which isn't that a state-on-state attack? And these are the kinds of things that Iran, rather than over the years striking back at Israel, striking back at the U.S., has responded, particularly to the Israeli killing of Iranians by just ramping up its nuclear program or developing stronger ties with Russia and China. This actions of the past weekend are really after Israel just went too far and bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus. All right, so let's talk about what the U.S. might do in response. U.S. will try to rally other nations to sanction Iran over Israel attack. I wrote this one for the Libertarian Institute on April 16th. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will attempt to convince the international community to increase economic penalties on Iran as punishment for the drone and missile barrage Tehran launched at Israel. Iran's attack followed Israel's assassination of several high-ranking officials when Tel Aviv bombed Tehran's consulate in Damascus. On Tuesday, Axios reported that the Treasury was preparing new sanctions to levy on Iran and will use the International Monetary Fund meeting later this week to try to convince other countries to join. Yellen said all options to disrupt terrorist financing of Iran continue to be on the table. The sanctions would be a response to Iran's drone and missile attack on Israel. The Iranian attack was in response to Israel's bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which killed 16 people, including 7 IRGC officials. Treasury will not, this is a part of Yellen's statement to the IMF conference, and Axios got advance access to it. So she was expected to say, Treasury will not hesitate to work with our allies to use our sanctions authority to continue disrupting the Iranian regime's malign and destabilizing activity. The attack by Iran and its proxies underscores the importance of Treasury's work to use our economic tools to counter Iran's malign activity. And think about how this works. The Israelis have conducted covert assassinations in Iran, including of high-level officials, right? And the U.S. just says Israel is our strongest ally. They're the only democracy in the Middle East. We have to support them. And you know, they have 1,000 reasons for this, right? Why the Israelis are the good guys and the Iranians are the bad guys. However, you know, the knock against Iran is, oh, they support terrorism. They're destabilizing. If you look at what's happened in the Middle East, particularly over the past few weeks, where the Iranians have you know, to some extent at least, tried to talk with the Americans and, you know, signaled to the American allies in the Middle East, the Arab states, that the attack was coming, and conducted the attack in the way that only hit Israeli military targets. I know a young girl was injured. I believe that was by falling debris. And only a few missiles reached their marks due to the fact that Iran didn't want to conduct a major attack inside of Israel. That was actually pretty tactful and not meant to cause a major escalation, but to be a response to what Israel did, which was very provocative by blowing up the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And so I think if you're weighing the two, this, you know, latest example is just another one to show that Iran isn't this major destabilizing force in the region. And in fact, if there is one, it's the Israelis and the Americans. So back to my article here. According to Axios, Washington hopes the sanctions will show Tel Aviv that there was a way to punish Tehran without a direct attack on Iran. The war government in Tel Aviv says it will respond to the Iranian attack clearly and forcefully. At this point, it's unclear exactly what that means. The Israelis have not explicitly said that it's going to be an attack. And from the reports that I've read, which I don't know if any of these are accurate, but there is, I would say now, a meaningful number of these reports that say Israel, the war cabinet, has decided to take some kind of measures against Iran, and the list of potential measures include major attacks on Iran to either cyber warfare, assassinations, or attacks on Iranian personnel in third countries. So talk about Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, maybe Yemen, which would all be less provocative than a direct Israeli attack on Iran. So it seems like there's a lot of options, and I've been talking about this, and I don't want to leave these stories sit about, you know, the potential attack and everything, because I think this could happen quickly, and, you know, at any day we could see an Israeli response to Iran. My guess is that they're not going to choose something too covert, because I think the purpose of it will be having a, you know, very public response to Iran. So, however, the Washington Post notes that the White House has few options for sanctioning Tehran, as the Iranian economy is already one of the most heavily sanctioned. The Post explains that one of Washington's few options for expanding sanctions on Iran is to blacklist Chinese firms that purchase Iranian crude oil. Pursuing that path may create more problems for the White House, as it will likely upset Beijing and drive up oil prices. The White House has been working over the past couple of months to tone down the hostilities between Washington and Beijing, and the U.S. actually just had a high-level military-to-military meeting with the Chinese, and so it would seem unwise, but in the way the Biden administration has also often been unwise, where they look at one conflict, the war in Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East, the Israeli genocide in Gaza, or the situation with Taiwan, the situation with North Korea, and they think that they have the ability to isolate all of these, and that, you know, if you take certain actions against North Korea, Iran, in support of Israel, against Russia, wage a proxy war against them in Ukraine, that these aren't going to have other down-the-line impacts on the U.S. trying to isolate Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, or something like that, because obviously these, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, these alternatives to the U.S.-led global financial system continue to grow as the White House tries to penalize more and more countries. And so I do think it's possible that they take this step and at least start to dip their toes in sanctioning Chinese companies for purchasing Iranian oil. I just think it's going to be a major problem if they do. Now, the reason they might not choose this path, I don't think really has anything to do with their ability to understand geopolitics, but rather the Biden administration is seeking to prevent an increase in gas prices during an election year and has previously asked Ukraine not to attack Russian energy infrastructure for that reason. And so I think that if there's a reason that we don't see sanctions on Chinese firms, it's probably going to be because Biden is worried about gas prices increasing, and that's hurting his election chances. All right, one more story here on the Iranian attack on Israel. And this is something that me and Will Porter, when we recorded our show on Sunday, speculated that this was maybe a positive outcome of the Iranian attack. So, report, Iran attack delays Israel's invasion of Rafa. This is from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, April 16th. Iran's reprisal attack on Israel has delayed Israeli plans to invade the southern Gaza Strip city of Rafa, CNN reported on Monday, citing Israeli sources. The sources said that the Israeli Air Force was set to drop leaflets on Rafa on Monday to tell the more than 1 million civilians who are in the city that an offensive was coming. But that plan was put on hold as the Israeli War Cabinet is debating how to respond to Iran firing over 300 missiles and drones at Israeli territory, which came in response to the Israeli bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus. And so I do think there's kind of a second point to this. I want to say that we talked about on Sunday's show, that I did think it was possible that this was one of the outcomes of the Iranian attack, that just due to the logistical needs of taking out all of those drones and the force positions that probably had to be shifted around, maybe even Israel is looking at loading kind of different munitions on its planes, and all these things probably have a pretty serious impact on Israel's ability to wage war in Gaza. And so it does seem that they're holding off on the invasion of Rafah. And I mean, in some respect, the situation in Gaza is probably only getting worse. There's not enough food getting in. There's not enough medical supplies getting in. And so delaying the attack on Rafah isn't necessarily going to mean that, the people are more prepared to be displaced once again, and that there's going to be less death or anything like that. But, maybe this gives Palestinians time to formulate plans, and there will be some more Palestinians that are able to leave Rafah before the attack begins, or the attack gets pushed off for a significant amount of time, and then the condition of some of these Palestinians, particularly in Rafah, does start to increase. And not that this necessarily should mean that Israel can attack the city, just it may not be quite so bad if the attack does occur for, all those innocent Palestinians that are sheltering in the city. Now, on the other side of that, something else that I do think is going to come from this is if the Israelis do not start a major war with Iran, I do think that they're going to punish the Palestinians for it. I think they're going to look to assert their dominance over the situation to show how big and bad they are. And look, if you're a bully, right? And you've been running the playground and everything, bullying everyone, and then bigger, badder bully moves into town. Well, you could either, try to fight that bigger, badder bully, or you could just beat up some of the wimpiest kids really, really bad to prove how big and bad that you are. And so I think that's kind of the path that Israel is going to take here, where they're not going to be able to issue a major attack on Iran, in part logistically. They can't do so without the U.S. support, and it doesn't seem that the U.S. is really interested in starting a direct war with Iran. Now, of course, Israel could carry out a less substantial attack on Iran without American help, and then in the ensuing war, then the Americans would get involved and help the Israelis, and that could be their plan here. I just think it's probably going to be a more muted response against Iran, and then a major attack on Rafah or the Palestinians in general, including maybe in the West Bank. All right, next up here. Ukrainian officials are jealous of U.S. defense of Israel during Iran attack. So this, again, from DataCampAntiwar.com, April 15th. Ukrainian officials have expressed envy over the U.S.'s response to an Iranian drone and missile attack on Israel that came in retaliation for Israelis' bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus. The U.S., UK, France, and Jordan all intervened to help intercept Iranian drones and missiles. Zelensky said, "The whole world saw that Israel is not alone in its defense. The threat in the sky was also being eliminated by its allies." The attack on Israel came as Russia is stepping up its missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which Moscow said was a response to Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries inside Russian territory. Ukraine has suffered serious blows in the strikes as it is running low on air defenses and as Russia's intelligence continues to improve. Zelensky said, when Ukraine says its allies have not turned a blind eye to Russian military and drones, it means action is needed, and bold one. It's not rhetoric that protects the skies. It's not opinions that curb production of missile and drones for terror. So the U.S. and NATO have not directly intervened on Ukraine's behalf due to the obvious risk of war with Russia that could quickly turn nuclear. In the early days of the war, Zelensky was asking NATO to impose a no-fly zone, which would have required shooting down Russian warplanes and bombing surface-to-air missile systems inside of Russia, but the idea received little support in Washington. Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, acknowledged that the U.S. and NATO wouldn't directly intervene, but called for more military aid. "Even if you cannot act the way you did in Israel, give us what we need and we will do the job." The $60 billion President Biden is seeking to fuel the proxy war in Ukraine still hasn't passed the Congress, but let's get some updates on what Speaker Mike Johnson is thinking, and apparently this guy is a warmongering lunatic. Johnson calls himself a, quote, wartime speaker and says he will push Ukraine aid despite opposition. So House Speaker Mike Johnson called himself a wartime speaker on Tuesday and defended himself after Representative Tom Massey called for his resignation over a plan to hold separate votes on military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Johnson said at a press conference, "We need steady leadership. We need steady hands on the wheel. Look, I regard myself as a wartime speaker." Massey said he would back Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's plan to file a motion to vacate, which would trigger a vote to oust Speaker Johnson. If every Democrat votes against Johnson, only 2 Republican voters would be needed to oust him, and so that would be Massey and MTG. Several Democrats signaled they wouldn't vote against Johnson if the bill was put forward, including the funding in $95 billion foreign military aid bill that passed the Senate. The Senate's $95 billion foreign military aid bill includes $60 billion for the proxy war in Ukraine, $14 billion to support the slaughter and starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, and a few billion for Taiwan and other spending in the Asia Pacific. Of course, a huge portion of that money is going to go right into the pocket of the donors of most members of Congress and their future employers, the military industrial complex. They're going to get billions and billions of dollars to make more weapons, and those will be sent either to Israel to blow up Palestinians or to Ukraine to, either kill Russians or just be blown up in a warehouse somewhere or sold in some corruption scheme. Other GOP members have expressed anger over Johnson's plan to introduce the military aid bills without any changes to border policy, but it's unclear if they will join MTG and Massey in voting against him. Johnson is also planning to put forward a 4th bill that includes a TikTok ban and give the federal government the ability to sell off frozen Russian assets to fund the war in Ukraine. The details are unclear, and the text of the bill is expected to be released sometime on Tuesday, so we should have some more details on that on an upcoming show either this week or early next week. The White House has signaled its support for Johnson's plan. It does appear at first blush that the speaker's proposal will in fact help us get aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel, and the needed resources in the Indo-Pacific for a wide range of contingencies there. At first blush, it looks like we just want to get more details. And so This was interesting because initially the White House said it had opposed a standalone military aid bill just for Israel. And so I guess if Johnson agrees to bring them all up in succession and they're all passed one after one after one, then the White House is going to allow it. I think the votes on these are going to be interesting. My assumption is the support for the Indo-Pacific, the Taiwan aid is going to have the greatest amount of support. The Ukraine aid is going to lack the support of about, I would say, 50 to 100 Republicans and maybe a token number of Democrats. And then the aid to Israel is going to maybe be short Massey's vote on the Republican side, maybe a couple of the Freedom Caucus Republicans, but I really doubt it. I think it'll probably just be Massey and then joining with 50 or 100 Democrats. And so overall, this is going to pass on some very overwhelming votes. You'll have large numbers of both parties vote against it, but essentially, the way Johnson schemed this all up, it'll be able to pass the House fairly easily. All right, next up here is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 15th. U.S. officials say new Russian Arctic pipeline is dead in the water. A top U.S. official declared that Washington is using economic warfare to prevent Russia from completing a new liquefied natural gas (LNG) pipeline in the Arctic. Officials in Washington threatened the Nord Stream pipelines before explosions destroyed 3 of the 4 pipelines that transited energy from Russia into Germany. On Monday, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources Jeffrey Pyatt explained that the U.S. had sanctioned Moscow in an effort to prevent the completion of Russia's pipeline in the Arctic, a project dubbed LNG-2. Our role is to ensure that LNG-2 is dead in the water, Pyatt said. We are very focused on ensuring that Russia is not able to develop new projects in order to redestine the gas that they previously sent to Europe. At the G7, we are collectively committed to doing everything we can to thwart Russia's future energy revenue. And so it does seem that the U.S. has maybe had some success on this. I read an article, I believe in Bloomberg, where there were some South Korean companies that seem to be lamenting that they could no longer participate in this project because of Western sanctions. And Putin announced this week that he would that Russia is really going to try to increase its ship fleet. I think in part to just offset sanctions in general. It's not necessarily just because of the sanctions around this particular LNG-2 pipeline. But in total, all the sanctions on shipping has really reduced the number of ships that are willing to carry Russian energy. And so Russia's going to create its own domestic fleet to replace the international shipping that previously did that. So, so back to the article here. While the White House says its crusade to slash Russian energy exports is intended to help Ukraine, maintaining high demand for American LNG exports has become a major political issue in Washington. House Speaker Mike Johnson is in negotiations with the White House to allow a floor vote on a bill that would provide another $61 billion for the proxy war in Ukraine in exchange for the Biden administration ending the pause of new LNG exports. The U.S., by the way, is the world's largest LNG exporter, so you could imagine there's a lot of energy companies spending a lot of money in Congress to try to get the Biden restriction on new LNG exports lifted. And isn't it funny that House Speaker Mike Johnson previously is against sending more money to Ukraine, and suddenly now that his House Speaker has all this power and also a lot of money flowing in, a lot of people probably calling them up saying we're interested in donating to your re-election campaign, but we got some issues with what's going on in Congress, has really influenced and prodded him to be willing to fight wars to get his, pieces of silver. So Pyatt's remarks are similar to threats made by President Joe Biden and then Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland in 2022 before the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed later that year. 1 month before the Russia invasion of Ukraine, Nuland said, "I want to be clear to you today, if Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward." In a late 2014 phone call, Pyatt and Nuland were heard planning the overthrow of the elected Ukrainian government and the installation of new rulers in Kiev with ultra-nationalist views. And of course, that particular situation, that coup in 2014, is the 8-year road that eventually leads to war in Ukraine in 2022. But the reason I thought this was important to include in this particular article is we know what happened with Nord Stream. We know who Victoria Nuland is. Now, Jeffrey Pyatt, the other person on that phone call with Nuland, who, Nuland is driving the car. He's like saying, yeah, I agree with you. This is a good idea. I'll help you to implement it and everything. But the fact that this guy, is now in the State Department and now making these kind of comments, I think is very concerning that, while he is specifically talking about sanctions when he says that this LNG-2 project is dead in the water, what are they really thinking? And obviously, Nord Stream 2 crossed into Europe, and so there are probably far more opportunities to sabotage that pipeline than this one. But I think that if I'm Russia, I take Pyatt's comments as a threat, and I'm very concerned that the U.S. is coming after these pipelines. So in September of 2022, 3 of the 4 Nord Stream lines were destroyed in a series of underwater explosions. Investigations by several nations have resulted in no charges, with few details made public after nearly 2 years. Some Western intelligence agencies point the finger at a small group of Ukrainians who had rented a yacht to plant the explosives, while an investigative reporter, Seymour Hersh, published an article alleging the White House ordered and planted the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and Hersh's article certainly had the most sources and the most evidence on this. So I tend to believe Hersh on this. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced that Moscow will bolster its its shipbuilding capabilities in response to U.S. sanctions targeting LNG-2 and, just the general sanctions on the Russian economy. Last week, he signed a decree ordering the production of more ships with an emphasis on those that can export Russian products. All right, next up here is a article I wrote for antiwar.com on April 12th. NATO's F16 transfer to Ukraine is limited by pilots and combat-ready aircraft. So the head of U.S. European Command told Congress that training Ukrainian pilots on advanced American fighter jets was progressing slowly. One of the primary suppliers of F-16s to Ukraine, the Netherlands, said that only half of its planes are combat ready. The planned transfers have been delayed almost a year since they were announced last spring, leading some Ukrainian officials to believe the weapons will no longer be a game changer. On Wednesday, General Christopher Cavoli, the head, told the House Armed Forces Committee that Ukrainian training was making slow progress, stressing that challenges of transitioning from Ukraine's current Soviet fleet of aircraft to NATO fighter jets. He said it's particularly difficult to go from the older Soviet-era aircraft that the Ukrainians have been flying, maintaining, and supporting. It's tough to go from that to modern fourth-gen aircraft like the F-16. Cavoli added that a shortage of Ukrainian pilots posed another obstacle, telling the committee that Kiev had a limited number of airmen to send for training, as many were needed for operations inside of the country. He said the first step was for pilots to receive introductory English language courses. After learning some English, the airmen will enter basic training. Cavoli confirmed that some Ukrainians have already reached this stage of the progress. Those who graduate must show they are proficient pilots before finally training to fly the F-16. And it's unclear to me if any of the Ukrainians are actually getting in the cockpit and training on these F-16s. Last year, the White House backed a NATO proposal that would have seen Ukrainian troops train on F-16s in member states, with the aircraft transferred to Kiev afterwards. However, the program has faced a series of delays. According to some Ukrainian officials, those delays have severely diminished any major advantages the F-16s would have given to Kiev. Often, we don't just get the weapon systems at the time we need them, they come when they are no longer needed, a high-ranking official told Politico. F-16s were needed in 2023, they won't be right for 2024. In addition to delays, Ukraine will only receive a limited number of combat-capable F-16s. While the Netherlands plans to send 22 of its aircraft, only 12 will be ready to fight when they arrive. And then some of the F-16s are not just in rough shape, but I think they're only airframes. So it's pretty loose to call it an F-16. It would be like somebody saying that, they got you a car and then they only showed up with a body. There's no engine in it. So in addition, and then the F-16s at Amsterdam's preparing to transfer were previously retired, with some in the need of significant repairs or refurbishment before they are airworthy. The same is true for the F-16s that Denmark and Norway will send to Ukraine. While numbers have not been publicly announced, both Copenhagen and Oslo will send Kiev retired aircraft, and some will be unequipped for combat. All right, next up here. U.S. General says NATO could surge troops into Eastern Europe. So this, once again, is Christopher Cavoli, the head of U.S. European Command, and he told Congress, this was last week, that NATO is prepared to triple its deployments to Eastern Europe. He said, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, NATO took the decision to establish battle groups on standing basis. He said, by design, they can go up to brigade size at a time of need, and that number of nations have already elected to go up to that. So after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the North Atlantic Alliance engaged in a massive eastward buildup, adding battle groups in 4 additional countries it dubs its eastern flank. NATO now has has battle groups consisting of at least 1,000 soldiers in each of those countries, and there are a total of 8 nations on the eastern flank. Generally, a brigade is 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers, meaning the NATO deployments could be more than tripled. The general explained the deployments are part of a definite shift eastward. The U.S. now has over 100,000 troops in Europe. Other countries such as Germany have also moved troops eastward. Earlier this week, Berlin announced they had permanently moved troops to Lithuania for the first time since World War II. The Washington-led NATO expansion and military buildup into Eastern Europe after the end of Cold War has been viewed as an existential threat by Moscow. In 2008, NATO declared that Ukraine will one day become a member, and the Kremlin warned Kiev that joining the alliance would cause a war. Over the past decade, Ukraine inched closer to NATO membership, and the alliance's forces were positioned near the Russian border. After Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, he explained that NATO encroachment was one of the core reasons for going to war. The Kremlin has made multiple offers to end the war in exchange for an agreement that Kiev would remain neutral and vow never to join the U.S.-led bloc. However, last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that was something Washington would not agree to, and that one day Ukraine would still join NATO. So there's just no interest in reality on the American side of this. All right, next up here, Ukraine's top general says the battlefield has significantly worsened. So Ukrainian commander-in-chief Syrsky said on Saturday that the situation on the front line in eastern Ukraine has significantly worsened in recent days as Russian forces are making steady gains. He said that since Russian President Vladimir Putin was reelected last month, there's been a significant intensification of the enemy's offensive. The Ukrainian commander said the warmer weather has made the most open areas of terrain possible for tanks, helping the Russians advance eastward. His comments came about 2 weeks after the Ukrainian military officer, speaking with Politico, said the front lines in Ukraine are at risk of collapsing wherever the Russian forces focus their offensive. Russia's current focus appears to be taking the town of Chaziv Var, which is about 9 miles west of Bakhmut. Ukrainian and Western officials have told the Financial Times that they expect Russia to launch a major offensive in late spring or early summer along the entire front lines, aimed at taking more territory in Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia, the 4 Ukrainian oblasts annexed by Russia in 2022. Besides gaining more ground on the battlefield, Russia has also significantly ramped up its missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure and has been much more successful in getting past Ukraine's air defenses. The Russian Defense Ministry said the strikes were in retaliation for Ukraine stepping up its attacks on oil refineries and other energy infrastructure inside of Russia. Next up here, and I want to just add to that story quickly that Russia says they have gotten most of those, that energy infrastructure hit by Ukraine repaired and back online. Now, Russia says it's destroyed one of Ukraine's largest power plants. This is, I believe, a geothermal energy power plant that is responsible for providing power for over 1 million people. The Russian Defense Ministry said the Russian armed forces delivered a massive strike last night by air, launched and seaborne long-range precision weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles against Ukraine's fuel and energy facilities. The goals of the strikes were achieved. All the targets were destroyed. It's unclear how long it'll take the Ukrainians to kind of get things back up and running. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 14th. Ukraine tightens rules on military service, angering soldiers. Ukraine's legislature advanced multiple new laws that tighten rules on conscription and extended military service for those in uniform. The new rules angered some Ukrainian soldiers. On Thursday, the Ukrainian Rada passed a bill that tightens the requirements to register with conscription offices and increases punishment for those who fail to do so. Additionally, Ukrainian lawmakers removed a provision in the bill that would have granted relief to soldiers who have been in combat for 36 months. The law requires Ukrainians at home and abroad to give updated information to conscription offices to receive government-issued driver's license and to have other official documents processed. A lawmaker from Zelensky's Servant of the People party who voted for the law said the law will change the procedure for listing people in military register as well as the rules for conscription. It will limit the possibilities of evading military service. To the surprise and dismay of Ukrainian soldiers, on Tuesday, the Rada stripped a provision in the law that would have ensured soldiers in combat for 36 months were rotated out. One Ukrainian woman said her husband, who is a soldier, was enraged by a law. The second wife of a second soldier said, You don't have to be at war until you die. You need to know when your service ends." Ukrainian soldiers said the move would lower morale. "This is very demotivating and demoralizing for the military," one artillery soldier told CNN. One Ukrainian lawmaker said the provision was removed because it was logistically impossible to implement. Kiev is facing a severe shortage of trained soldiers. A second member of the Rada, who chairs the country's Wartime Oversight Commission on Monitoring Aid, said, "We are in a very weak position right now. Last year, Kiev was preparing for an offensive. Now its troops are desperately trying to form defensive lines to hold off the Russian offensive." A legislator in the opposition party in the Rada blasted the ruling party over the removal of the provision. "The right to be discharged is an important incentive," she posted on Telegram. The Servants of the People party, that's Zelensky's party, and their satellites have spat in the face of the military and their families. The law also includes some incentives for recruits and soldiers. Those who enlist will have some discretion over their assignment. Additionally, soldiers who capture or destroy Russian weapons will be given financial incentives. The Rada advanced another law last week that will allow prisoners to volunteer to fight in the military to get out of jail. The new conscription law follows Zelensky signing a bill that reduced the conscription age from 27 to 25 earlier this month. All right, this is the last article here today. U.S. General says Russia's military bigger than before the Ukraine invasion. And of course, this is something that we've known for quite some time, and we've been talking about it. And also the way that the Americans have looked at it, basically, if we kill Russian soldiers, destroy Russian tanks on the battlefield in Ukraine, that this makes Russia weaker. I think it fails to understand that Russia has spent the past 2 years fighting against Ukraine, who is acting as a proxy for NATO. And so while a lot of the Ukrainian weaponry has been their older Soviet-made weaponry or older Soviet-made weaponry from, former Warsaw Pact or Soviet states that are now a part of NATO who have transferred their weapons to Ukraine, a significant, meaningful chunk of the Ukrainian weaponry has been NATO standard issue weapons. And I think the important impact there is Russia has now designed and developed its military capabilities not to fight jihadists or, rebels, whatever you want to call them, in Chechnya, in Syria, somewhere in Central Asia, but rather to fight an actual war against a NATO-trained, a NATO-equipped military, which is what they've been doing to some extent in Ukraine. And so, look, even if the most dire predictions that like 250,000 Russian troops have been killed or injured in this fighting are true, that would certainly have major impacts on Russia if true. Russia has also developed a lot of very advanced military technology to be able to fight against specifically NATO weaponry and NATO strategy and tactics and things like that. And so to the idea that the army would become significantly weaker by fighting this war, I don't think really ever made sense. All right, everybody, I'm going to wrap up the show there. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. Connor Freeman coming back on the show tomorrow, and then I will have another show out on Friday. Again, thanks everybody, and we'll be back with another one soon.